panel 3. I just want to do a little shout out and see where you're all dialing in from. So we've got folks from India, Germany, the UK, Poland, Australia, Portugal, it's like the Eurovision, Honduras. That's fantastic. Welcome, everybody. Please continue to share your locations in the chat. It's great to see you all dial in from all over the world today. So without further ado, I will introduce you to panel 3. We've got 3 fantastic speakers, and our moderator, Phoebe O'Hara, is going to be joining us on the stage. I will hand over to Phoebe to take it away.
Thank you, Clara. And hi, everybody. Really great to be here. A big thank you to Simon, Clara, and the team for inviting me to host this unbelievable panel. Truly honoured to kind of be alongside some of the leading figures in the industry and to speak about a topic that I think is on everybody's minds. I just got back from a 3-day conference in Amsterdam for the Battery Raw Materials Conference by Fastmarkets, and battery passports was really a topic that kept coming up as something that kind of lacked a lot of understanding and awareness. So I'm really glad that we're discussing it today. Just to give some background on who we're going to be welcoming to the stage. The first is Ellen Carey, who I actually had the joy of interacting with at the conference in Amsterdam. So Ellen is the Chief External Affairs Officer at Circular, where she engages with corporations, policymakers, NGOs, and members of the media on Circular's ability to bring transparency and material traceability to complex industrial supply chains. Ellen has dedicated her career to advocating for clean energy technologies, running successful campaigns for technologies such as EVs, renewable energy, and other markets that shape market dynamics and create new business opportunities. She's held senior positions at Samsung, Audi, SAFE, and the Electrification Coalition and the American Clean Power Association, working internationally across policy, communications, and corporate development. We then have Stephanie Schenk. Steph is a project lead with Systemic's Circular Materials platform. She leads the 3-year Battery Pass Consortium project, which aims to advance the implementation of the battery passport. Prior to joining Systemic, she worked as a strategy manager for battery cell manufacturer in Northvolt in Stockholm, though she has spent most of her professional career as an e-mobility expert at McKinsey in Munich and Tokyo. She holds a diploma in business administration and studied at the University of Applied Sciences, Kempten, as well as the University of Seville. And lastly, we have Hege Marie. She currently serves as the Executive Vice President, Corporate Public Affairs and Sustainability of FREYR. She previously served as FREYR's Batteries Executive Vice President, Human Resources, Sustainability and Communications. Prior to joining FREYR, Ms. Norheim was with Spencer Stuart and also held exec roles at Norsk Hydro and Equinor, serving as Chief Sustainability Officer and FCP Reserves and Field Development. Ms. Norheim has also held the positions of Senior Advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister of Norway and State of Secretary to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. Ms. Norheim holds an MSc in Economics and Business Administration from the Norwegian School of Economics and Hochschule St. Gallen in Switzerland. So I think that gives a sense as to the unbelievable array of speakers that we've got. Truly in awe at all of your experiences and knowledge of the industry. What we're going to do is we're going to start off just to give a real in-depth amount of detail as to, what battery passports are in Europe currently, and give a lot of detail there so that we kind of set the scene as to what we're thinking about and talking about with the EU's policy. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Steffi, who's going to share some slides and kind of communicate all of her expertise in this area.
Yes, thank you so much, Phoebe, for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to open this panel from my side with a little bit of a broader introduction in what actually the battery passport is. We thought that would be helpful before we actually start discussing around the topic for a rather long time, and then also await your questions later on. So some of you might have already heard what will be presented, others not. Take it as a brief update again. So if you go on the next slide. What's important to know is that the battery regulation actually entered into force last month in August. And that means that now we have very specific timelines running and requirements coming towards us in the next years. The battery regulation is very far in its scope. So it covers for the first time as a product focused legislation the entire battery life cycle, and includes a lot of elements ranging from, for example, restricting specific substances to due diligence policies, certain labeling and marking requirements. It contains requirements for safety, for removability and performance and durability, or as most of you have probably heard about, also the carbon footprint. And among the many requirements is also the mandate for a battery passport. It has been dedicated an entire article in the regulation, and the requirements for the battery passport then relate to a lot of these other articles in the battery regulation. So you always have to look at the document as a whole, and it's very informative to actually take some time and read it. If you're only very specifically interested in the battery passport, you can always refer to that specific article. If we go to the next page, so what is the battery passport asking for? It's basically asking for a lot of data that will be reported. It needs to be reported by the first quarter of 2027, so basically 42 months after the regulation entered into force. And the passport is mandatory for batteries in electric vehicles, in light means of transport, and for industrial batteries that are larger than 2 kilowatt hours. Responsible for issuing the battery passport is the so-called economic operator who is placing the battery on the market. That's a very abstract term, and who specifically that is always depends a little bit on which battery application we are looking at. If you take electric vehicles as an example, then in that case it would be the automotive manufacturer that has the responsibility to issue the battery passport. We have different access groups defined in the regulation. That's 3 right now. First of all, the general public. Then we have certain authorities, for example, the European Commission or market surveillance authorities, and then a third category, which is called interested persons. And this term still has to be defined by the Commission a little bit more specifically, since it is more sensitive, given that group will have access to more detailed information that is requested. And therefore, it has to be analyzed very precisely who should have access to that more granular information. Then if we go to the next slide. One previous, I think. Yes, that's the one. So here we see the 7 categories the Battery Pass Consortium has came up with that try to cluster a little bit the many data attributes that need to be reported in the battery passport. Overall, it can be up to 90 data attributes, so quite some information that needs to be collected and reported. And that ranges from general information, like, for example, the battery category, so electric vehicles, or the battery weight. Then we have labels and certification requirements, then requirements to report the carbon footprint, both, for example, as an absolute number, but also as a share of the individual life cycle steps. We have also supply chain due diligence requirements in form of a due diligence report, a PDF document that will need to be uploaded to the passport. Then lots of materials and composition data attributes, ranging from the battery chemistry to whether hazardous substances are included in the product or critical raw materials. Then circularity information, that could be the share of recycled content in the battery, or certain manuals for providing information how to disassemble the battery. And then the last category, which is called performance and durability, something like the expected lifetime, the capacity, the state of health. So as you can see, lots of data along the life cycle that needs to be reported. If we go to the next page, it is supposed to visualize a little bit how this data will be collected. So typically, if we remain in the electric vehicle category, you would start from the automotive manufacturer here in the middle, at the bottom of the slide, OEM, and then the automotive manufacturer collects a lot of data from the upstream supply chain. So basically, manufacturers will step into agreements, contracts with their suppliers, and these suppliers maybe then once more with their suppliers until all the necessary information will be provided. Then the same happens for downstream. So here it could be different parties that have the responsibility for reporting information for the passport. For example, the recycling company that would need to change the status of the battery, putting it as recycled, for example, or waste. And this information then goes to various back-end systems. And from these back-end systems, you can then shape a battery passport and provide specific access rights to the groups that I mentioned earlier. Next to this battery passport system, the Commission will be responsible to also set up a passport registry that will have likely rather limited information simply on the passports that are basically available on the market, so to say, with their IDs. Of course, there are solutions that will help us in the future to make data reporting a little bit more easy. That could be traceability systems. So in the future, and I'm sure you heard a little bit about that from Optel, and Ellen, as an expert in that area, will also be happy to answer any questions. These will make life for data collection a lot easier. If you talk to particularly the industry, what always comes up as a core question is what's the benefit for the industry? And that's quite important because we all know that the battery passport is a compliance tool, and to some extent we have to fulfill these requirements to meet the regulatory asks. But of course, it shouldn't fall short, and there are huge benefits that are actually linked to the battery passport for individual stakeholders. So individual stakeholders along the value chain have specific data available. So if we take, for example, a recycling company, they will receive lots of information on the composition and the materials of the battery, but also, for example, as I said, manuals how to disassemble the battery. And that will make life so much easier for them and save a lot of time and cost, of course, and also increase efficiencies in the process. So in the end, it's always linked to either increased revenues or profits, or also then saving emissions and making more material available on the European market. And that's benefits that's actually also good for society as a whole. If we go to the next page, there's a lot of more information than that you can read up in case you're interested. From the Battery Pass Consortium side, you can refer to what we call the Battery Passport Content Guidance or our data attribute long list in case you want to smarten up a little bit on what's specifically requested. Soon we will also release a document on how the battery passport system will function, and also about the benefit assessment that I just mentioned. And these should just trigger a little bit the discussion also for later on. And I hand over to Phoebe. I think you have already a couple of next questions for us prepared.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Steffi. That was so clear. That was fantastic, really easy to follow, and thank you for the beautiful graphics as well. I think you mentioned the key question here really in your presentation, which was how is this policy going to affect business, and what is business's key questions? Hege, I want to jump to you. Obviously, you are at the forefront of battery manufacturing, at the center of those conversations right now, and I want to ask you, how is this affecting, from your perspective, business, but also what are the opportunities and difficulties that you guys are facing with legislation like this?
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you for those core questions. I want to start by saying that I'm in a hotel room. I'm really sorry. I'm worried about the connection.
You're coming through great. You're coming
Okay.
through amazing.
If it disappears, I'll turn off the TV now that you've seen me, so then I can at least participate in the debate. And I want to thank Stephanie for an excellent presentation of a quite complex and huge area that you have both, done a fantastic job in Battery Pass in trying to get, all of our heads around in a comprehensive way. And it really shows that you understand every detail when you're able to present it in such an elegant and simplified version in 10 minutes. So, really kudos to you, Stephanie. I think my main message is really that for businesses like FREYR Battery, who are a battery cell producer in Europe and eventually also, hopefully also in the US, I think for sure in the US, actually, we'll come back to that. This is a gift from heaven. This regulation makes it possible for companies like ours who want to be part of the decarbonization of the world and produce batteries that are key products to enable that, and who want to produce products that are produced with low carbon footprint and a great footprint in all other aspects as well, environmental and social, to actually showcase that. This creates transparency for us in the market and towards our customers that is reliable and sort of assured by regulation and standardized, so it's comparable. So to us, this means gives an opportunity to monetize on those efforts and that sort of business proposition that we want to contribute. I want to make an interesting point here, though, because FREYR is actually not in the first instance going to produce batteries for cars, but rather for the power market. So the BESS, the battery energy storage systems. And here we do find that our customers are, already producing wind and solar because the batteries will be stood and really sort of enabling them to scale. They find themselves quite green and wonderful already. So the focus from our customers on this aspect of actually buying batteries that are in themselves, green and low carbon and sustainable in every way is sort of less of a focus. So even in that segment, I think the regulation is really helping us again prove the point, because there's less drive in a way from the customer side. But I think the EV sector is very much also customer-driven demand for these data and for these proof points. So I just want to make that point. And then I think, we are a small company. So the regulation is also very helpful, given that we would want to, even without this regulation, to work with our supply chain. It's a global supply chain. We have to go to Argentina and Australia and, all over the world and China to get these raw materials and the active materials. In the situation we're in now with this battery regulation, we will have Volkswagen doing the same. We will have, the whole industry in Europe will be asking for this data and will be approaching this global supply chain. And for us, it would have been impossible. But now that we are an industry on this journey together, I think it really, makes it plausible or even actually very possible. I can see, and I can allude to that later, that we have competitors that are producing outside of Europe that are now clearly, designating factories outside of Europe to produce for the European market, to be able, where they are going to be low carbon, renewable energy supplied, and they are working on their supply chain together with the rest of us because they want to go to the European market. So I think there's some great aspects of this regulation. And then I'm sure we'll come back to the challenges of, the standards not really being there yet, and the implementing directives sort of being developed now, and the standards that we need, and the cost that this is going to require, and the fact that we see other regulators sort of also thinking in this way, but maybe doing it a bit different. So the need for alignment of these standards and regulations and requirements across the US, Europe, and potentially other places is obvious issues we need to discuss.
Hege, you have just set me up beautifully to segue to Ellen on that. Thank you so much. I don't know if that was purposeful, but that was brilliant. Speaking there about, the need for synthesis between different regions. And Ellen, you are beautifully placed to speak on this, given your expertise and knowledge kind of across the Atlantic. I guess what I want to ask you is, given your work, what in your mind are the demands that these policies are posing on business in different regional or global contexts, and how do we see these demands growing with time?
Thank you, Phoebe. So going a little bit around our screen here, it was wonderful to get to see you in Amsterdam as well. Steffi, also excellent, sophisticated job on presenting such a complex content guidance of the Battery Pass project. I would encourage the audience, please, to read the content guidance from the Battery Pass project. It really is the most up-to-date guidance on what is in a battery passport as required and compliant with the EU battery regulation. So we're on a journey of learning and going into the secondary legislation, and that's an excellent resource. And Hege, thank you very much for your comments as well on both transparency, but then what you were leading to is the collaboration that's enabled by that transparency. Couldn't agree with you more. So in terms of Circular, we are a global technology company providing transparency to complex industrial supply chains. We are seeing growing demand globally for knowing what happened to materials from mine all the way through processing to production to manufacturing. So zooming out a bit from the EU battery regulation, one, I would applaud the European Commission and everybody who's worked on since 2020 about, if not before, on this regulation, because it's unprecedented. As Steffi said, it is the first policy that looks at a whole of value chain transparency mechanism, and it is trying to create from linear economies, circular economies, and then get collaboration based on competition and innovation, which is great. Zooming out a little bit too, I mean, Europe is not the only one that is investigating a battery passport project or product or putting it into force. Coming from the US market, the Clean Vehicle Tax Credit acts very similarly. Although it may not have a requirement like an embedded carbon footprint, it takes a different measurement. And what's needed to comply with a Clean Vehicle Tax Credit is knowing what happened to what materials along that value chain and taking certain calculations of that. So very key is, one, digital supply chain mapping, two, accountability through material traceability of what's happening, three, collecting the different data that's necessary, and then very importantly to an EU battery passport or a Clean Vehicle Tax Credit certification, let's say, is also the translation of that information on the compliance of that product with the market requirements and the communication to customers. In the US, that comes in the form of either the car qualifies for 3,750 of tax credits that we get off our tax, put into our IRS tax report every year, or 7,500 if it fully complies on both the critical minerals and the battery components. We also see other markets acting very similarly. India has a battery passport requirement. It approaches it differently, but innately wanting to keep battery assets, which can be recycled and taken care of within borders and put into that circular economy. Korea and Japan as well, looking at embedded carbon footprints, etc. Now, we're only talking about batteries here, but this really is the state of where we're going in terms of doing business, right? We will know where have our products been, how sustainable, how responsible they are. The battery, these regulations set a very good baseline, right? And spur the collaboration. And now we are starting on a journey of raising the bar. To Hege's point, sharing more information, dropping that, embedded carbon emissions, being more transparent. The baseline set, and now we can really, companies can really go above and beyond and showcase that. And I think for markets, they get greater energy security, climate security, and economic security as well.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Ellen. I think I'd want to push you both a little bit to unpack maybe some of the difficulties that businesses are facing, because we've all alluded to the fact that Steffi's done a brilliant job because of how complex the policies are, right? So they're difficult without that presentation to really understand what's going on. So I'd love for you both maybe to flesh out some of the areas that businesses need help on, or areas that may be tricky to kind of introduce in the near term without support from, the likes of Circular or, other companies as such, or Steffi's Battery Pass? I don't know, Hege or Ellen, either of you want to take that?
I do think the global requirements is creating complication. It's requiring a thought up front on what's needed by when and how to look at their global supply chains. So from a Circular perspective, we provide supply chain mapping, material traceability, battery and digital product passports, also sustainability and compliance. Now, those different modules can be applied in a flexible and modular way over time that's properly sequenced to companies' needs. So we're hoping to help with the question we get often, which is, how do I get started? What does this journey look like, right? And it is a journey of different data. First, probably knowing your supply chains, which many don't. Second, holding them digitally accountable and holding them accountable with the data and the data, proper data collection. And third, growing and building out that battery passport product, especially in parallel and in tandem with the secondary legislation that's coming. So my job is not only to talk about regulations and policies, but also to inform our product team and our client and customer success team on what our clients need to provide. So it's not onerous on them, but it's a full service from Circular.
If I may, maybe I can add, Phoebe and Alan. Can you still hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. I was just going to say that, as I think Stephanie, made the point very early on, this is a full value chain. So, the data that Freyr produces in our own factories and in our own assets and facilities are relatively, we have control of them and we will be able to assemble them. And then it's more a question of what exactly is the standard going to be and how exactly do we calculate the carbon footprint and where do we want to upload it and in what fashion. The real challenge is, of course, when we turn to our supply chain, which is in our case only maybe 100 suppliers from the mines and all the way up, because we're a very young and one product company. But for the likes of Volkswagens and others, it is thousands of suppliers. And you have to introduce this idea that you want now new data, and they don't even, they are obviously not collecting this data today. And they have to turn to their sub-suppliers and ask for the same data. So the communication and the ability to do that efficiently is really, I think, what we're up against here. And then I do think, and Stephanie can comment on this, I'm sure, that the Commission has and seem to be approaching this in their secondary legislation in a way where you can also use industry standards and sort of back office calculations without actually having the primary data from your supply chain. So you can, but that will then show that you're no better than others. You're using industry standards, so you're not actually able to then document that your product is actually produced in a low carbon way, for example. So I think these are obvious some of the challenges. And then Freyr is, as I'm saying, a startup. So we are building all these systems from scratch, lucky us. So we don't have any legacy. We are introducing the contracts with suppliers now, and we can have this conversation from the start, and we can showcase everybody else is coming as well. But for the likes of the big players that have already been in this market for a long time, obviously, getting their data collection or data software now changed, introducing this to very established and quite complicated value chains is a big endeavor.
Yeah, and something I want to bring up, because we were discussing it quite a bit at the conference in Amsterdam, is the difficulty of raw material traceability, right? That poses a lot of questions, and I'm just looking at a lot of the comments just to bring up some kind of audience participation, right? A lot of the questions in the comments are surrounding how the battery passport will kind of analyze how companies are tracing those raw materials in the upstream and how that's going to be evaluated, but also B, an interesting point, which is, will that added emphasis on traceability shift the industry's raw material partnerships because of the need to be more transparent? Steffi, I think maybe we come to you first with that one in terms of maybe unpacking some of the raw material aspects there is there in terms of the policies? What exactly is it saying that needs to happen in the upstream? And then after that, Ellen and Hege, if I come to you about maybe some of the other more industry-wide dynamics that might precipitate in terms of industry response.
Yes, of course, very happy to. So basically, the first intent and first step of the regulation will just be to create transparency. So you have to report along specific data attributes in the material and composition category. As we briefly have seen before on that slide with the many data attributes, it's, for example, simply reporting on the chemistry. And there's always an intent to why this information should be reported, because somebody in the value chain actually benefits from it, or the consumer might benefit from the information to be able to, in a conscious way, procure products in the future, and also to be able to compare products against each other. But of course, then a different aspect would be safety. That refers to, for example, hazardous substances. So again, for a recycler that handles the battery, or a company that repairs the battery, it's very important for them to be able to understand what's inside, what am I looking at, and ideally without doing the assessment again on their own, and then another company is again doing that on their own. So this is also about causing efficiencies for other stakeholders of the battery value chain. You're not always thinking from your own perspective, but thinking really about the battery as a product and the entire ecosystem and the other stakeholders, and how you can improve the entire process for a large objective, so to say. So for talking about these questions or materials, of course, there will be traceability, and especially in the supply chain category, there are considerations or challenges like child labor or forced labor, which ideally would be avoided in the future. The question is always how long will that take and how far will we get with it? But at least you will have, as Ellen already also mentioned, you will have the knowledge about it, because so far a lot of companies don't know their supply chains. They don't even know if something like this happens. And at least this visibility will be available in the future. And then you as a company can do conscious decisions about your suppliers, or ask your suppliers to select also their suppliers based on the principles and values you as a company follow. Yeah.
Can I step in there, Phoebe?
Absolutely. I was just going to call on you.
No, I was just going to say that, you asked the question, does this change our behavior in the supply chain? And I do think that many of the battery cell producers have sort of proclaimed that we will now, and Europe has said it's a goal to move the value chain to Europe. And I think the US and the Inflation Reduction Act, has a very explicit goal of that, moving the supply chain to America. In Europe, I think in both of them, it's for national security and energy security issues, and I'd like to talk about that. But it's all, in Europe at least, it's also about getting control, or easier than thinking that you can control the environmental and social aspects of the value chain. And FREYR has done this. We have announced that we will now co-invest with our cathode producer in Finland in order to, or we haven't made the investment decision, but we're working on that in order to take it to Europe. But I would say that with the scale that this industry is about to see, and we're already seeing, we are scaling battery production many, many folds every year, and it has to scale, more than 10 times till 2030, more than 10 times globally. There is no way that we do not need the whole world in this endeavor. And the countries who have some of these, critical minerals and resources absolutely deserve to be part of this journey and get the value of the minerals and resources that they have to provide this decarbonization journey for the world. And it's an enormous opportunity now that the US has actually put in place a financial framework and a subsidy scheme that is a game changer for renewable industry in general, particularly for battery production, that will, that we are already seeing has, multiplied the investments. that we are going to scale this. We have a real chance to really decarbonize the world both in the power and the transportation sector, and so we need to bring the world with us. And it really requires transparency. We don't want to scale something 10 times in a bad way. We want to scale it while we avoid child labor, while we avoid forced labor, while we avoid carbon footprint, etc. So this is just so important. And in that aspect, I also just want to mention that there is a Global Battery Association where I happen to be on the board. So this is a piece of promotion, though, but where we sit with the whole value chain globally. The Chinese players are there, the American Tesla is there. We're all there together, and the supply chain from all over the world. We don't have them all on board yet. We're working on that, which are also putting forward a battery passport for all the global players, where we're sitting together with NGOs and in a multi-stakeholder dialogue discussing the same issues. And I think this is really important approach to bring everybody along, and also hopefully a contribution to this alignment of regulation as well that we will see across the board.
And maybe to
Ellen,
just quickly...
Oh yes, go for it, Steffi, go for it.
Yeah, just one thought, maybe quickly adding to what Hege mentioned at the beginning. It's not about crossing out specific regions that some people might associate with unresponsible working conditions. That's not the aim, and I think that's important to repeat, because talking, for example, about the Republic of Congo, there might also be mines in Congo, and battery cell manufacturers like FREYR, for example, might work already quite intensely together with these mines to set up responsible working conditions there. Yeah, so there sometimes might be an association to specific regions that almost this entire country follows unresponsible working conditions, which of course must not be true. So it's not about crossing out on a regional, very easy approach, specific countries or regions, but really assessing it on an individual level.
Thank you, Steffi. Ellen, I will jump over to you.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Steffi closed with that slide about quantitative value that comes with digital transparency. And let's call it battery passports, but also product passports, and the coupling of ESG and investments in the upstream with the material traceability. I mean, that's in essence a product passport, right? That is delivered to the downstream. And when you're doing it very sustainably, responsibly in the upstream, that's a large investment. And so a upstream miner who is investing in more renewable energy through extraction and processing, innovative ways to reduce water use, et cetera, they, attaching, say, their third-party audits, that information to the material itself, then ensures that the downstream is actually receiving that material and can change the financial game and eventually or possibly pay that green premium because risk is reduced to the downstream and greater proof of sustainability, responsibility that is able to be marketed to the end customer as possible. So that's where material traceability comes in terms of, is it hard, is it difficult, et cetera? It's not easy. But I think that we have all woken up from one era of goals and a bit of greenwashing and saying we're going here to many other folks in the industry or consumers saying, well, now we're going to need proof. And that proof really comes with knowing your supply chain and ensuring that in that product, that sustainability and responsibility that you expect is indeed included.
Yeah, I think that accountability is really coming through, to be honest, in what you're saying. I think obviously the thing I want to end on last is obviously next steps. And Steffi, I want to kind of come back to you for this. We spoke a little bit when we first met about, what's up next, what are we expecting? Could you kind of lay out some of those attributes that we were speaking about, some of the cross-sustainability DDD discussions? That's Hege's kind of line of thought that we were speaking about. But yeah, the secondary legislation process would be great to touch on.
Yes, of course. So basically, all information that's currently available is put in an aggregated way, including lots of further information in the content guidance of the Battery Pass Consortium. But still, although we have tried to make the content of the regulation digestible, a lot of questions remain open because what is specified in the regulation is not specific enough. So especially on a couple of technical points, the Commission needs to deliver more information, more guidance, more methodologies so that the industry is actually able to implement what is requested. Because otherwise, what will happen is that manufacturers or companies will choose their own way of interpretation of what this data attribute means and how you could collect it or calculate it and then report it. And then in the end, you won't have the transparency and comparability that everybody is aiming for. So this is to a good extent already planned for. And this is what we call usually the secondary legislation process. And under this secondary legislation process, you have so-called delegated and implementing acts. And now that the regulation entered into force last week, a timeline also for these delegated and implementing acts started to run. So if we take the example of the carbon footprint, that is one of the first and most urgent things that will need to be specified, since the requirement already will be enforced at a very early stage. So until February next year, the methodology for calculating the carbon footprint will need to be defined. It is currently discussed and analyzed in an expert group. The JRC is in the lead for doing that together with the European Commission, and they reached out to a lot of experts. Among others, there was also a colleague from our consortium involved in the beginning of the process to provide feedback on first suggestions on this methodology, and then try together with knowledgeable people to shape it into a direction and bring it to a consensus that most organizations can live with. And this then will be released, as said, for electric vehicles. Yeah, so that's important. Every application also typically follows a different timeline. So for the carbon footprint, we have the first requirements for electric vehicles. And then the industry has a year to basically prepare until they will need to report on it. And going back to challenges, again, also relating to this process, you see that a year is probably not a lot of time for an organization to prepare for that. And that's all true for the entire regulatory requirements, especially on the technical side of things, that time seems to be very short to be able to implement things. So the earlier as you as an organization can start looking into that, preparing on that, join initiatives, alliances to discuss, to exchange, try to find some clarity, please do that, because otherwise you will be surprised about how many requirements you will need to fulfill very soon.
Yeah, I think with your help, there's a lot of clarity being provided, but a lot of work that seems to need to be done. Hege, can I come to you on that question of kind of next steps, given your work with GBA and some of the other things that we spoke about in the prior discussion?
So the devil is in the details, I would say here. So we are following the secondary legislation process quite closely. So for example, on the carbon footprint, I just want to point out that for example, how to decide how scope 2 on carbon emissions should be actually accounted for is a highly political question in our view, and quite challenging. And this area of carbon footprint, however, is also currently being discussed in many other directive processes in the EU that concerns other industries, including, however, also the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which also requires all industries on an annual basis, not on a product basis, but on an annual basis, to start reporting carbon footprint of their business, including scope 3 and scope 2. So, this is actually coincides with a lot of other processes that is going to be very important. And I am very curious. Our view is that actually right now we see that the Commission is struggling to even know and align across their own, work in different spaces to come out with the same sort of approach and standard. So this will be very important. And we are, flabbergasted by the idea that we need to get in place a system, start collecting data so that we can actually report on this. There's a timeline there that sort of doesn't really come together looking at the deadlines. So we will be working as an industry absolutely to have a view, for example, on much more flexibility on the implementation of the regulation than we see currently.
Thank you for that, Hege. That's really candid. That's really helpful. Yeah, Ellen, can I come to you for next steps? You and I spoke yesterday, I think it was, the day before, about the implications globally, next steps in the US. Can you give a little flavor and insight into that?
Certainly. I think on the US, on the clean vehicle tax credit, we're still waiting further guidance through the comment period that has happened with the US Department of Treasury on exactly how to calculate some of the things that they're asking for. As Steffi has articulated, Europe does very well on the guidance and the specifics and the devil's in the details, as Hege said, on this regulation. The US is catching up on that front. And also there will be a definition that's needed on what it's calling foreign entities of concern. Now, keep in mind too, this guidance that has come out is really only for 2024 and 2025. The current guidance does say we will revisit it 2025, knowing the capabilities of material traceability, and that is the expectation for the next ramp ups of that access to the US market and those taxpayer funds.
Yeah, and you and I obviously spoke a little bit about the traceability conversations going on in Congress, which seem to be progressing quite far as well. So that sounds pretty positive from what we were discussing.
Yeah. There is a carbon border adjustment mechanism legislation in the Senate that has been proposed by Republicans. So this is also Chris Coons of Delaware, Sheldon Whitehouse, some moderate Dems, and Republicans on the Senate side are looking at enacting a CBAM. I think it has a sister legislation in the works on the House side. And then there was, so I see that as something that's been brewing, so that the US is working hand in hand with Europe in their enactment of a carbon border adjustment mechanism as well. I think also we've done a lot of educating. I've gotten a lot of questions within DC about what's Germany doing, what's this project, what's the Battery Pass project, and there's I think there is appetite and eagerness to align and work off of this great guidance that has come out of Germany and Europe on how to get this done. There will need to be global alignment, and that's certainly understood and seen in the roadmap.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. We're going to jump to Shada is going to come on and do a bit of Q&A based off of feedback we've gotten from the audience. So I'm going to pause myself here and let Shada jump in with some questions for you guys.
Hi, everybody. I've been monitoring the thought-provoking questions from our audience, and they're very interesting questions. I needed to choose just two for the moment. So the first question from Alexander Scott: does the regulation require any testing that the amp hours listed on the battery label can actually be attained? Anything to prevent manufacturer from saying the battery is 105 amp hour when it's actually 99 amp hour brand new? So do you have any thoughts on this?
So that's a very specific question. I think both Ellen and Hege will be happy if I try to answer it. So I would need to go back to the specific labeling requirements in the respective article in the battery regulation. I can't recall spontaneously. I don't think so. Yeah, there should be different parameters that are requested to put on the label. So I would answer for now with no, I think that specific information is not requested to be reported, but it should be available from the respective article in battery regulation.
But Stephanie, maybe you can comment on the requirements around assurance of the data in general.
Yes, so of course there will be also auditability needs to be guaranteed, so to say. So specific text parts are already included in the regulation where this is requested. And auditability plays also a role beyond that. Yeah? So for specific of these data attributes, of course, there will be independent organizations or authorities that make sure that the information that has been provided actually is reliable and fulfills a specific quality. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the valuable insight on this question. And the next question is from Nick Dunkley. It appears that input from raw materials for the cell are defined as optional. Gut feeling is that there is where the most significant embodied energy and emissions are. Is there any reason for making this optional? And is the panel aware of a date where raw materials declaration are mandatory?
Steffi, do you want to take that as well? I mean, it might go back, it might couple with what you said just now too, which is auditable data as well. So something that can be assured and verified.
Yes, so the question has been rather long. It's a little bit difficult to find it under the comments, so I'll try to recall the text exactly. But there is certain information about raw materials that needs to be reported. And I think the question also had a link to the carbon footprint and the emissions. And I mean, as I quickly mentioned earlier, the carbon footprint will need to be reported as an absolute value, but also by the share of individual life cycle phases. Yeah, so this at least will be considered in the reporting of the footprint. So even from the mining life cycle step, the emissions will be a part of the overall value that needs to be reported.
Yeah, and I thought what you said before was really great, like auditable, granular data. I mean, this is obviously going to authorities in all of these markets. So the data needs to be sound and with reliability and neutrality that that companies can stand behind.
If I may also
thank
add,
you very
because
much,
I think this was partly something that I was just going to say, maybe partly also something I alluded to. The details on the carbon footprint is as Stephanie was saying, currently being discussed. But one of the proposals is that you can use industry standards. Hence, you don't need to declare the actual footprint from the supply chain, which is exactly right where much of the footprint will be found. But that will mean that you are going to report very high footprint. Because the standards will, most likely then represent, either an average or a high end of the footprint in the value chain in the industry globally, rather than hopefully something that you can work on getting down. So there will be strong incentives to actually do the primary data.
Brilliant.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much for all the panelists.
Yeah, I think we're going to jump to a networking session after just now, but I just want to take some time just to thank Alan, Hege, and Steffi for taking time out your day. It's always really inspiring for me to hear from you guys. You have such expertise and knowledge. And also from a personal front, amazing to see three trailblazing women in the industry. It's always really refreshing to have an all-female panel. So thank you for that. And thank you to Battery Associates for making that happen as well. So yeah, up for some networking now. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.